I realised there was an opportunity to actually put those two sides of my brain together and shape policy and shape politics in line with my environmental values and passion.
Dare I say that I believe humanity is plagued by viewing the environment as a separate thing.
There's 88 recommendations, I think, of how to, it's quite a nice number, that 88 recommendations, right? Not 100, but 88 specific recommendations of how to reform the UK water sector. So we haven't, I think that in itself perhaps needs a separate podcast. Okay, well, a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Stream podcast with Will and Tom, an unscripted, unedited, free-flowing conversation featuring guests who reject the status quo with a bias for action in the world of water and beyond. My name's Tom Freyberg. I'm an environmental journalist specialising in water.
I'm Will Sarney, a water strategy advisor and investor, doing my part to solve wicked water problems.
Thanks, Will. And a big shout out to our charity partner, Frank Water, and our ongoing sponsor, Raymond James. And we're pleased to kickstart season 9 with a focus on water and nature. So historically, we've looked at locations like the Colorado River Basin. We've looked at the topics of water and agriculture, but we really wanted to pivot this season to look at the intersection and the link between water and nature. So we are thrilled to kickstart with Guy Thompson, who is the managing director of EnTrade, a marketplace for nature recovery. So Guy, thanks for joining us, and great to see you.
Thank you, Tom. Good to be here. Thank you, Will. Pleasure.
So Guy, you come highly recommended. A quick Google search, it reveals you were, to quote, honoured as the EN's Power List Environmentalist of the Year 2025. So congratulations, a great award there. And I think you're on a mission to accelerate private investment into nature restoration. And one of the numbers when we're doing a bit of research for the show that came out was there's said to be a £44 billion nature finance gap over 10 years in this country alone. So we're interested in the next 30 minutes to kind of find out how you're playing an active role to kind of direct investment to plug that gap, and kind of how you got to EnTrade and where you are. So something we typically do with our guests is sort of ask for their origin story, whether they're founders or investors. So we're interested in kind of that role of becoming managing director of EnTrade. There's a bit of history behind it, and you spent some time at Natural England advising the government, and there was a pivot from the public to the private sector. So we'd love to kind of, tell us a bit about the role then at Natural England and kind of what you learned from that as a way and a genesis to kind of get you to where you are today.
Thank you, Tom. And going to your framing of the basis on which you invite guests to your podcast. I mean, that is what I'm about. I want to make a difference by enabling a fair and efficient transition to a nature positive net zero economy. That's kind of my why in a nutshell. And that really goes back to my values, which and I would sort of position myself unapologetically as a career environmentalist, which reflects my childhood interest in nature and the solace and the peace I got actually as a young boy growing up in rural England from just spending time in nature and cycling and walking and being in semi-natural kind of wilder landscapes.
Guy, whereabouts did you just to sort of butt in there? Whereabouts did you grow up in when you mentioned rural England? Yeah, whereabouts was that?
Yeah, the south of England. I mean, I was actually born in South Wales, so my formative memories were, kind of 5-6 years old, sort of peering out into the back garden at the foot of Table Mountain, just sort of in the foothills of the Brecon Beacons. We moved around a fair bit, so I remember a stint in Birmingham where I did, I felt, I think, fairly denuded actually from that access to nature. Sort of leaned in quite hard to the, to Sutton Park and time there, and then my really formative years were growing up in North Wiltshire, where I was lucky enough to grow up in a small market town with access to relatively unspoilt agricultural landscapes, and just did the and had the benefit as a young boy of having that relatively free childhood, roaming the country lanes on my bike, right? So that's kind of as part of it, there's the sort of one side of my brain which is about my values and passion for nature and seeing that and seeing future generations get the benefits of the natural environment and clean access to clean water and healthy wildlife. But also the other bit of I like to describe it as the other bit of my brain because it took a while for the two bits to connect in my career, which is political. I did a politics degree at University of Sheffield. I grew up talking politics around the dinner table, and it took me a while. And coming back to your question about my time at Natural England, the logical starting point for me to bring the two sides of my brain together was actually working in the environmental NGO community as an advocate. So I began my career with a series of environmental and conservation charities in the UK, latterly running Green Alliance, where I was, really proud to lead the what is the kind of and remains the leading environmental think tank in the UK, and has done a lot of the heavy lifting on promoting the environment to politicians and business leaders, and had the privilege of considerable access to the heart of government actually at the time when this was back in the mid 2000s when Tony Blair was starting to become sensitized to the need to put the international climate change agenda into the heart of the international community. So that was kind of where I brought the two sides of my brain together. But then coming to my time at Natural England, the natural transition for me from that role was moving into a public service context and working. I was lucky enough to be given the opportunity to go in and become a founding executive director, founding member of the executive team that created Natural England, the government's expert advisor on the natural environment in England, from startup, from a three-way merger between two public agencies and a bit of a core department, and it just felt like a natural kind of succession for me from what I had been doing in making the case from the NGO world to politicians and regulators and policymakers to actually being part of shaping public policy and implementing regulation at the coalface. It was an organisation that brought together the landscape, access and nature conservation agendas in an integrated remit, and that excited me at the time, and it had considerable levers to influence the delivery of that remit on the ground through the agri-environment budget to incentivise farmers and land managers. So that's kind of what led me to Natural England, and I was there for 12 years in the end in a series of executive roles, latterly as their chief operating officer.
Guy, when was the moment in time when you realized that you wanted to build a career around environmental? I mean, it's very understandable, growing up in nature, being part of nature. I mean, was it like really, really on, early in your life that you said, boy, I want to do whatever this is, without really knowing what a career would look like? I mean, for me, it's always an interesting point as part of, that moment in time in somebody's origin story. How far back did it go for you?
So Will, yes, from the very first moment I recall thinking about my future career and life, it assumed that I would be in some way harnessing my passion for an interest in the environment. But I struggled with what that would look like. I struggled with that for, I think, a combination of reasons, but it was partly the lack of obvious career paths and vocational pathways to take me down that route. It was partly my background and my skill set actually as somebody who is really stronger in the humanities than in the sciences, and my awareness of the sort of natural disposition of people who moved into the ecological world to have that skill set. And it was partly born of probably of my risk appetite and the sort of sense that in some ways there was sort of financial risk attached to moving into quite an uncertain career path. But nonetheless, yes, from the outset, I always assumed that the environment would in some way shape my career and life. And I slightly, I wound up moving into, once I'd done my degree, a period of my life where I went out and just wanted to experience the world. I guess, that classic, I had the benefit and opportunity to just spend a bit of time kind of traveling. I worked for a period of time for an overseas wildlife tour company. It took me to
Oh, wow.
some exotic places. I spent time in the Indian subcontinent in particular, Pakistan, India, Nepal, leading and also undertaking conservation research for wildlife organisations. So it kind of took me down that route of just exploring the world, actually. And it was then only when I came back to the UK and I was lucky enough, having kind of got into a period where I was starting to drift into a career at the coalface of nature conservation, that I realised there was an opportunity to actually put those two sides of my brain together and shape policy and shape politics in line with my environmental values and passion.
So you're touching on something that I've always been fascinated by, how people talk about the environment. And I dare I say that I believe humanity is plagued by viewing the environment as a separate thing, like the environment, as opposed to us being a natural part of it. And, if you speak to First Nation communities, they don't see the distinction between their world, who they are as beings, and environment. They just don't have language that makes that distinction. But, I would say more people than not would say that, oh, well, that's the environment. I need to not pay attention to the environment, which is what's happening here in the US, clearly. Or I need to pay attention to the environment as opposed to I am the environment. So I don't know. What's your take on that? Do you see that? And could be because you're in a country that, seem to value it more than we do.
I see that, and I obviously buy into that because that's partly how I keep myself grounded. The kind of permanence and sort of existential kind of nature of how we experience the natural environment. For me, underlines that point. But I'm equally alive to the fact that in a modern context, I am unusual in that respect, and I guess coming to the sort of reflections on how I believe I have actually pivoted over the course of my career to a skill set and a way of thinking, I guess, that would perhaps have been more typical of somebody moving into a more traditional career. I believe it's partly the need to connect those the kind of mainstream kind of toolkit and the mainstream kind of ways of thinking that guide our kind of established economic systems and processes to our values and to how we value and the benefits we acquire from the natural environment, which is going to be key to how we manage the transition to a nature positive economy. If that makes sense.
Oh, it makes perfect sense. I love how you framed it in terms of grounding, but also, recognizing that that's not universally shared, and there are economic development and business issues that tie into the environment. And Guy, by the way, you are the perfect guest to kick off this season in terms of really valuing the connection with nature and being part of nature. And I don't say that lightly. So thanks for doing this.
That's good.
I think the other reason why Guy is a perfect guest, and we didn't know this before we started, was being a Wiltshire kind of born and bred. I mean, similarly, it was my home county, right? I was actually born in Winchester, Hampshire, but grew up in Wiltshire. So there's a lot of I can echo your thoughts when you say about those years of cycling about, with freedom on a bike in the countryside, swimming in rivers. It was exactly my kind of childhood growing up many moons ago. But I think when I hear your story, Guy, you mentioned there about being a kind of founding member when Natural England was just forming, and then you kind of spent a decade plus in the public sector. And now where you're working is arguably a startup, right? So there is this kind of entrepreneurial sense that I get from you as well. And then perhaps can you talk a bit about kind of the role of the government in a top-down approach on making an impact in nature restoration compared to what a private sector startup can kind of do in terms of agility, action, and creating an impact? So I think that's where you're maybe drawn to, like actually creating stuff and then seeing an impact on nature, which is arguably what you're doing now.
No, 100%. So I mean, I enjoyed my time at Natural England. I had outlived my time at Natural England after 12 years at the coalface, or actually probably to use a more apposite metaphor in an ivory tower, actually, because you inevitably running a big organisation. At the top of that organisation, you are in an ivory tower to all intents and purposes. And whilst you can get out and about as I did, and spend time with people and stakeholders and ground your knowledge of what your business is about. It was that sense of detachment, I guess, between the ambition of that organisation, the strategic direction we'd set out at Vesting, and the impact we were having, which in the end led me to move on and to seek an environment where I could innovate and explore how to make a bigger impact, and that did lead me. And I've just stumbled across EnTrade by accident, and I should give full credit here to the origin of the EnTrade story, which lies with a UK water utility, to make the link back to your theme for the season, Wessex Water in this case, the rationale for that was I was exploring routes into the private sector. My kind of my intuition was it's partly about where I was in my life actually at that stage, and how I was developing, but it also reflects my sense that there was an opportunity in the private sector to make a bigger impact. And there was an opportunity, moreover, for the private sector and the water utility sector in particular to make a bigger difference when it came to environmental improvement. So that led me to exploring routes into the regulated water industry, and in turn, took me to Wessex on placement for a month to just test the waters, as it were. And it was there I discovered EnTrade and stumbled over EnTrade. And Wessex had effectively created a market-based mechanism on the back of 2 decades of working with a group of farmers in one catchment, where it got on a logical journey from influencing those farmers and raising awareness of the impact of land use and farming in particular on its sources, the impact on drinking water quality in the very first instance. Having built those relationships and started to establish better incentives to influence farming practice, had started to explore ways of influencing on the wastewater management side the impact of farming practices, and had negotiated a derogation from the Environment Agency for the delivery of a 40-ton nitrate reduction as a regulated obligation, rather than through the traditional asset-based solution, which would have been a nitrate stripping plant at one of its sewage treatment works, and instead working with those farmers to utilise relatively temporary, short-term solutions through the way in which they were cropping on the land. And that led them in turn to EnTrade, because on the back of that, you've effectively got there a single buyer, in this case Wessex Water, procuring what's described in the parlance as an ecosystem service from a group of farmers. In this case, nutrient reduction, nitrate reduction. So you've got the basis of a market emerging, which is where EnTrade came into being.
That's super interesting, isn't it? Because, like you said, traditional approach would be a hard technology to remove the nitrates from the water. But actually, having the 2 decades plus of the relationships with those farmers, it meant that they're on board to actually change their behavior to stop the nitrates getting in the water in the first place. But that doesn't come overnight from getting farmers to change, right? Unless there's normally a regulatory approach. So it's interesting how the genesis for EnTrade and what you're doing started with the utility and then the relationships with the farmers to then kind of create that market mechanism. So yeah, that's yeah, super cool. So
Just to build on that point, Tom,
mm.
briefly, you're absolutely right, because there you've got a ready-made test bed to innovate, and you've got, as you say, trust and knowledge and established relationships. What I discovered, of course, is that takes you only so far when it comes to thinking about what we have subsequently done with EnTrade, which is where I wanted to take it. Because look, coming in from Natural England, my perception was, well, there's a basis there of a marketplace, right? Which is this long-term vision for what we were about, to drive funding into nature recovery, to take public funding, private funding, and to use that to drive more cost-effective outcomes for nature. But of course, that requires you to go on a very significant pathway to design a market, and a two-sided market. That has been the story of the last 5 years, and to go from where we started with that test bed and a single-sided market to where we are now with a market mechanism that can deliver fair, efficient, transparent outcomes in a
Guy,
marketplace, bringing multiple buyers together with multiple suppliers simultaneously. That's been a far bigger and steeper learning curve than I ever anticipated.
Guy,
Sorry, Bob.
payment for, I'm sorry, payment for ecosystem services has been around for a while. What's changed? I mean, do you see greater interest in payment for ecosystem services in the UK and also elsewhere? And a related question is, do you see other EnTrade type organizations elsewhere in the world? Like, do you see this being replicated? Your model.
So my sense is what has changed is simply the language, it's certainly in the UK context. We've gone through a phase in which we were, I think, philosophically attracted to the idea of payment for ecosystem services, to a greater focus on the assets and on natural capital, and we're sort of now in a slightly confused phase post Brexit, I think, where there's I think a growing recognition that it just isn't that simple, and we need to think much more deeply about how we evolve what are pretty entrenched existing regulatory models, actually, for incentivizing or for certainly protecting existing assets to where we need to be, which is incentivizing nature recovery. And that's a very, very different paradigm. So I think we're just embarking on that journey. And I think my sense of it, insofar as I can give you a really well evidenced one from an international perspective, Will, is that the role of markets is starting to become a more visible part of that conversation. That is hugely influenced and informed by, and I think and sort of troubled by the experience of the voluntary carbon market in particular, and the very well publicised failures of governance in the voluntary carbon market, and in some cases, in some other jurisdictions, biodiversity offset schemes. So that is quite challenging, because you're then comparing apples and pears, in the sense that the voluntary carbon market is about effectively trading in a global commodity, tons of carbon, whereas in these nature markets, we're talking about markets that should be about the delivery of verified environmental improvements in services that can only be valued at that local level, and therefore are delivering much more tangible community benefits in that respect. So that is a problem. But I think, coming back to your question, the role of environmental markets is certainly on the rise, or the kind of recognition that environmental markets may have a greater role to play in delivering public policy goals for environmental improvement, be that water quality improvement or nature recovery or any other goal. But there is huge uncertainty, I think, still about the relationship of those markets to existing regulation and public funding in particular.
That sounds fascinating in terms of how to think about, what this journey looks like, and the tension between valuing natural capital and getting the public sector, including utilities, to improve, ecosystem health, but also, water quality and so on. Really interesting.
I was reading, Guy, you mentioned about how EnTrade is evolving and you've got different forms of capital coming in. But one really interesting stat was around property development companies, where they have to, is it 10%? Let me get this right before I misquote it. 10% increase in biodiversity value to secure planning permission. So essentially, you're working with these property development companies, right? So they can have a quantifiable impact in biodiversity, the impact of 10% of that. So a company wants to come and build 1,000 houses. Essentially, the value of 100 of the houses has to be demonstrated as an impact, and you guys are kind of making that connection. Is that right? Yeah.
So there's a lot to unpack in there. I'll try and do so briefly, but there's in the journey we've been on, we explicitly started this journey in 2020. It happened to be the beginning of the COVID pandemic. Not a total coincidence, actually, because looking into that, it became apparent to us that the impact of the pandemic on public finances might be the straw that breaks the camel's back, actually, in terms of the dependency or the expectation that public funding alone could deliver environmental improvement. And you also had, post-Brexit, the opportunity to evolve the regulatory framework in the UK on the back of the Environment Act and the legally binding targets that the Environment Act was going to be driving, to think about the delivery mechanisms that could achieve that environmental improvement. So there was the sort of market design piece we've embarked on. That was a big body of work, and that's about how you manage risk and how you can enable certainty in terms of the credits you're generating from a market, that in the event of project failure, contractual failure, those credits will actually attach themselves to real units of environmental improvement on the ground. That's been a big job. And there's a very significant body of work in terms of the legal framework, the interplay between the legal framework that we use and our market rules, and the governance of EnTrade, which I can touch on separately if that would be helpful. Your question goes to then what drives demand. We sort of embarked on that market design journey in anticipation of there being a demand driver, and that was partly predicated on the expectation that biodiversity net gain, which is the mechanism you described, was going to be a thing. It was on the face of the Environment Act, and it remains a very significant driver of demand. The experience we've had in our markets is you can achieve good outcomes for in this case for housing developers and for nature through the mechanism we use, but it has created significant nervousness inside government, because it's early days for that mechanism, and I think the challenge we've got is we've got these very audacious targets for environmental improvement. We have in biodiversity net gain a mechanism which has a metric behind it. Actually, it's not perfect, but it does have a metric which has the benefit of a considerable body of work backed by government and its regulators. But what we haven't got is the architecture behind the role, how this market gets rolled out nationally, that remains a quite significant challenge for a range of schemes, and ourselves included, who are already operating in this market. And there's not insignificant nervousness inside government that these sorts of mechanisms could actually become constraints on development. The challenge becomes this, the temptation by government to manage the symptoms of the problem, which are putting in place the enablers, as opposed to actually the enablers of the long-term solution. Yeah,
That's really well put. Symptoms as opposed to the root cause. Yeah,
we
that's
have a
great.
piece of legislation before Parliament right now, which sort of exemplifies that particular problem. But we won't get into the weeds on that. And I'm mindful, Will, that I didn't answer your earlier question about whether there are other EnTrades out there. I mean, and this remains our challenge. Is in many ways kind of Wessex and now EnTrade were thinking a long way. We were thinking a long way in advance of where regulation is. We hoped and anticipated that by generating use cases and in particular going through a open source market design process, which we deliberately and consciously attempted to do in collaboration with the public sector. We attempted to create a kind of sandbox type of environment to enable that learning and that flexible approach to evolve. We hoped that by creating that environment that regulation would in turn be informed by our use cases. And I think that what I'm trying to describe is the mismatch between the ambition, the target ambition we have in a world-leading piece of legislation here in the UK in the Environment Act, and the delivery mechanisms available to drive that environmental improvement. Now, I believe that if you can get the underpinning regulatory framework right, get the incentives right, get those national targets translated into something more meaningful and given local expression, and you can largely leave the private sector to innovate and get on with the delivery of those targets. But it's that mismatch between target ambition and the delivery mechanisms that we are wrestling with in real time.
Right.
So coming back to your question, I'm unaware of any mechanism out there like EnTrade. Our role is we are a market operator. We're an environmental market operator. We are a central counterparty essentially to transact with two sides of the market. The closest analogy you can make to what we do is the stock exchange.
Oh, wow.
It remains to be seen whether this is the case, but I'm unaware of an equivalent to what we do elsewhere in the world. Now, we hope that gap can close very rapidly between where we are and where the regulatory framework is here in the UK. And, we are hopeful that that can be the case, because if we're going to incentivise the private sector to play its part in nature recovery, and water utilities would be a really great case in point, the regulatory framework is going to have to evolve very rapidly to enable the likes of EnTrade to play our part in that transition.
Really, really interesting comparison.
Well, I think we've come up with a title for the episode, Guy: A Stock Exchange for Nature Recovery. There you go.
Perfect.
There we go. It wrote itself. So, Guy, I think the other part of this story is, and I think actually how we came into contact was through a mutual connection at a big engineering consultancy, Arup. So I think talk about this innovation in the business model, because you talked about the genesis within Wessex as a utility. You've got EnTrade as the startup, and then you've got the kind of environmental consultancy. So talk to us about why that's perhaps a little bit unique when scaling this as a kind of mechanism of marketplace beyond Wessex and across the rest of the UK as well.
Okay, so the crux of it was it comes to the point where, having incubated EnTrade as for a long time, Wessex Water, I mean, we did so for a long time actually outside of the regulated business by necessity, because there was always an expectation that we might be creating markets for the water utility to participate in. Going back to my earlier observations about the regulatory framework, that's not yet been able to be the case, but that was always the expectation. So we've operated at arm's length from the regulated business as a independent business unit in the parent company of the utility through that incubation phase. But there always came a point where EnTrade had to grow up, having established our role as that market operator and properly codified it through the legal framework, the governance mechanism, and so on. Spinning it out was the natural next step. And the catalyst for that in the end was the strong interest shown by Arup in what we were doing. And we've learned through the last 3 or 4 years by working in partnership with Arup that we were going to benefit from their expertise. So we vested EnTrade as an independent company in February 2025, and it's backed in joint venture by YTL UK, the owner of Wessex Water, and in a minority stake, Arup. Arup are bringing their expertise to how we scale the model, and that comes, I guess, it comes in many manifestations, but I guess the primary focus is on their digital expertise in particular. They've been pivotal to us, to the work we've done subsequent to launching the business, in building a market platform which went live in June, and we're about to run a nature market in Cornwall which will utilize that market platform for the first time. So that's key, because not only does it automate our market processes and make it simpler for buyers and suppliers to participate in our markets, but more importantly, it enables us to deal with the inherent complexity that comes with managing the scientific uncertainty associated with delivering the projects and tracking credits from cradle to grave in our market, so that it hosts the registries that will enable regulators and local authorities to interrogate our market information and be assured that the credits relate to real units of improvement on the ground. So the digital expertise is key, and we see that digital expertise lending itself to how we can enable a whole ecosystem of different digital providers to participate in our markets. Upstream to support on project development, downstream to support on verification, monitoring, and reporting. And then secondly, they are an engineering consultancy, as you say, Tom, but nonetheless, they've innovated at the margins of the traditional grey infrastructure model to understand how you can enable greener solutions to coexist, particularly in a peri-urban environment. And having that mindset, bringing that expertise to opportunities like how would you take an EnTrade market and design it for the incentivization of retrofitting new housing, or existing housing stock for water savings devices, or incentivize the retrofitting of existing infrastructure for sustainable urban drainage systems, or running a market that would enable us to incentivize landholders and farmers to establish natural flood management measures. There's a range of other environmental services that lend themselves quite well to that blend of engineering and scheme design expertise that Arup bring to the endeavour.
I think it's a really interesting model, because I think we've often touched upon that kind of pre-catalytic community between the multinationals and the startups to kind of for replenishment goals. But actually, this is kind of engineering consultancies that you mentioned have a certain scale, are already working with certain utilities, and then, as you mentioned, you kind of had to spin up and grow up, so to speak, as a company, and then partnering with something of that scale, suddenly you've got doors that have already been opened for you. So maybe the final thing we want to touch on, Guy, and hopefully this isn't so much of the elephant in the room, so to speak, but it was only a couple of weeks ago now that the Cunliffe report has come out, which is making shockwaves across the UK market. Some are saying it will be the biggest kind of radical overhaul of UK water sector. There's been lots of already mentioning about the abolishment of the regulator Ofwat and actually creating this new super regulator. Given your background then in kind of politics and touching on regulation, there's 88 recommendations, I think, of how to. It's quite a nice number, that 88 recommendations, right? Not 100, but 88 specific recommendations of how to reform the UK water sector. So we haven't. I think that in itself perhaps needs a separate podcast. So there's a lot of pressure to ask you to summarize and give us your thoughts. But yeah, what is your kind of knee-jerk reaction to the Cunliffe report? Do you think it's what's needed and it's a step in the right direction?
So, and full disclosure, I should
Yeah.
have said that for a long chunk of the innovation journey with EnTrade, I had played two roles. I had a dual role as a group sustainability director of Wessex Water, helping Wessex think about future regulation and influence future
Right.
regulation
Okay.
and
Okay.
policy, and then incubating EnTrade as a mechanism that could be part of the future delivery landscape if that regulation was to come out. So my perspective on this is informed by that dual role,
Great.
and
Yeah.
so a significant amount of the energy we put into advocating for policy change, which is reflected in what Cunliffe has brought forward, is this need to
Mm.
go from this traditional approach to regulated water utilities, which is focused on the large scale improvements achieved through addressing point source pollution, to a world in which, with you know, with the low hanging fruit having been taken in that context, and the need to find more cost effective approaches to delivering environmental improvements by water utilities, the need to go upstream and think about the benefits of working within the wider catchment to prevent the problems at source. And that's not an easy job. That requires thinking and designing environmental regulation in a much more holistic way, and that's not easy. And a lot of our advocacy was about thinking about and incentivizing water companies around the range of different drivers that the water company is better placed to think about and manage the trade-offs within. So, for example, between the benefits of these catchment-based approaches and nature-based solutions as an iconic expression of that, for a range of environmental solutions, environmental services beyond cleaner water, beyond the very narrow agenda of specific outputs for nutrient reduction. There's a range of environmental services that could be factored in alongside the benefits of minimizing the carbon footprint of those interventions. And of course, importantly, thinking about the impact on the bill payer and the customer. And the water company's far better placed if incentives reflect those different drivers to manage those trade-offs. That's what the private sector does, right? It outperforms. It outperforms its competition, even if in this case the competition is effectively comparative regulation. So
Mm,
it's the
mm, mm.
ability to take the incentives as they were designed immediately pre-privatization to a world in which that requirement is a lot more challenging, a lot more holistic. That I think drives Cunliffe and drove a lot of our advocacy for these more holistic approaches. I mean, my immediate reflections on Cunliffe is it's a very significant step forward. I have a worry about the focus on institutional change. It's always a temptation for a politician to pull
Mm.
that institutional lever. I know from my own experience of creating Natural England that can come at a cost in terms of political capital, the distraction of senior leaders, and so on. But that kind of horse has bolted, right? So you have to accept we have to make the most of that institutional change, but that will not be sufficient. And I think outside of the institutional changes that are anticipated, there's a requirement for strategy to be translated into the types of incentives I've just spoken about. And importantly, that goes beyond the regulation of the water utility sector. That goes to the range of actors that water utilities need to be incentivized to be able to collaborate with: farmers, landholders, flood management authorities, highways authorities, housing developers, and indeed, of course, local communities. At the moment, the incentives do not enable water companies to play a proactive enough role in those partnerships. And that really will hinge on whether we can move to a smarter regulatory system that unlocks that innovation by balancing the incentives and risk and outcomes that enable water companies to come to those kind of judgments on a commercial basis. So quite a lot to do there, and I think it really comes back to the need for that honest conversation ultimately about who pays.
Mm.
We've
Right.
tended to shy away from that, and the last 4 or 5 years, certainly in the UK context, with a very significant focus on some of the worst excesses of financial engineering, the challenges around dealing with the impact of climate change, and the lack of investment in infrastructure on sewer overflows in particular. That's kind of toxified the ability to have that debate.
Mm. Mm.
And at the end of the day, if we want the improvements in the infrastructure and the environmental improvement, we're going to have to find more cost-effective ways of incentivizing that investment, and that will come back to regulation, whether we like it or not.
Very good. Well, thanks, Guy. Yeah, there's lots more to sort of unpick I think from the Cunliffe report. I know there's a upcoming white paper, and it's going to take a lot of time to kind of digest some of the recommendations there. So appreciate your honest and very well grounded viewpoint, as you mentioned, your time there within Wessex. So yeah, well, listen, thanks so much for the kind of the background. I think hearing about your time advising the government, and as you mentioned earlier, kind of having scratching that itch to then move into a kind of startup, and then actually having an impact on kind of nature restoration and linking in more forms of finance is super interesting. So I'd love to kind of keep an eye on this and see how it grows across the UK and beyond as well. So yeah, thanks so much. Really enjoyed the conversation. Will, any final closing words from yourself on the conversation with Guy?
I look forward to tracking all of this, because this is going to be rich with lessons learned, which is why I asked you the question, is this being replicated anywhere else in the world? It also ties into a conversation I've been having with a friend and colleague in the NGO world about, how do we really rethink who pays, and how do we bring in truly diverse actors to solve catchment watershed challenges in terms of quality of water, scarcity, access issues, and so on. So this has been really informative for me, and really appreciate you being on.
Grand. Well, Guy, thanks so much, and we'll keep in touch.
Thank you. Very welcome. I've enjoyed the conversation. Thank you both, and all power to your elbow with your new series.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Guy.